What makes a man who and what he is? Some will point to life experiences, some to upbringing, but the truth is that both of those factors only reinforce a genetic code that is passed down to us, sometimes from our distant ancestors. This is why two different people can go through the same life experience and have two completely different reactions. What is in one person's blood causes that person to react one way, while the different genetics in the other person cause a dissimilar one. If we were to take the Cuban lightning and rewind his generational ancestry backwards, we would eventually stop off with the first generation we will examine. In 1813, in La Guaira, Venezuela, the governor and representative to the Spanish crown was Don Francisco del Marmol. It was a period of turmoil in Venezuela, a little over halfway through the Venezuelan revolt against Spain, led by Simón Bolívar. The revolution intruded itself in the form of an attack by the rebels on Don Francisco de Marmol's hacienda. His 15-year-old son, Raimundo, and 7-year-old son, Francisco Jr., barely managed to escape the carnage. The soldiers of Bolivar seemed to spare no one, not slave, nor elderly, nor even children. From their place of concealment, they could hear the cries of women and children, begging for their lives, and then the sound of shots that preceded the dreadful silence. Once night had fallen, the brothers made their way back to their home. There they saw that their parents were both still living, now captives of the rebels. Along with their two sisters, they were tied in a long line of prisoners, all bound to a wagon carrying wounded rebel soldiers. The house was looted, and Raimundo watched helplessly as the rebels set fire to the house, stables, and everything else on the property. They kept a safe distance as the soldiers took the prisoners to the town of La Guaira, where Don Francisco de Marmol and his two of his assistants were ordered to dig their own graves. A tall man stood arrogantly by, smoking a cigar. This was the outlaw Porfirio, who was at that moment in command of the rebels. The graves were filled with wood, which was then set on fire. Before Raimundo could do anything, the firing squad began its work. Very badly, as even after several shots, all three prisoners were still alive. The man smoking the cigar walked up and kicked each prisoner, including Don Francisco de Marmol, into the fires to burn to death. Horrified, but realizing there was no time left, the brothers left to join some friends to free the rest of the family, where they would escape to a boat that was provisioned and waiting for them. Once out to sea, they encountered a Spanish galleon, which ultimately took them to Cuba. We then travel another 60 years to the 1870s. In the Cuban town of Bayamo, Raimundo and Francisco grew up and started families of their own. Raimundo's son, Donato, became a leader in Cuba's revolution against Spain, this time against the Spanish. Indeed, the political climate on the island was growing worse. Increasingly desperate to retain control over its colonial possessions in the New World, the Spanish crown ordered its governors to become increasingly repressive. Donato had two boys, Donato Jr., age 15, and Julio Antonio, age 12. But the peaceful life the family had longed for in Cuba was coming to an end. Thanks to the lies told to members of the Royal Army by a conniving neighbor, the Spanish crown reaches out towards Donato de Marmol's plantation. Forced by the lies of that neighbor into a violent confrontation with a squad of soldiers, he realizes that war against Spain is now inevitable. He frees all his slaves and burns his sugar plantation to the ground. Sending his family to the hacienda of his wife's family, he begins to organize those former slaves into a fighting force. Unfortunately, fate intervenes once more as the family comes across a Spanish military patrol. Concealing the wagon, Donato Jr. decides to provide a distraction to increase the chances of the rest of his family reaching safety. Unfortunately, his younger brother followed him as well, deciding to join forces to lure the soldiers away from the rest of the family. They lead the Spanish on a chase through the jungle. They conceal themselves, but the searchers grow closer, and discovery seems inevitable. Seeing unattended guns, Julio Antonio bursts out from cover to retrieve them, only to be captured. Despite his tender age, Julio Antonio is executed by decapitation before the horrified eyes of his older brother. As these two separate generations prove, the de Marmols are resilient, resolute, and principled. Above all other principles, it is the fate of every Demarmal to prize freedom and liberty, a fight any of them will take up, even if it means sacrificing their own lives in the pursuit of it.